11:23 at night, August 7th, 1944. The ground south of Caen trembles, not from shelling, from something heavier, something mechanical, something alive. 600 armored vehicles are moving through total darkness, tanks, half-tracks, and something no army on Earth has ever used before. Infantry carriers built from the gutted hulls of American self-propelled guns, welded shut, stripped of turrets, crammed with 12 Canadian soldiers each. They have no official name yet. The men inside call them Kangaroos. Dust swallows everything. Drivers cannot see the vehicle in front of them. Radio direction finders click in turrets, tracing invisible beams toward the German lines. Overhead, the drone of 1,000 RAF bombers bleeds across the sky, their payloads already falling on the flanks of a 4-mile corridor aimed like a dagger straight at Falaise. The infantry rides blind, sealed inside steel, breathing diesel fumes and fear. This is Operation Totalize, the first large-scale mechanized night attack in the history of modern warfare, and the man who designed every detail of it, the columns, the carriers, the timing, the darkness itself, is a 41-year-old Canadian Lieutenant-General named Guy Simonds. He is about to tear a hole through some of the most formidable defenses in Normandy, and the Germans on the other side have no idea what is coming. By early August 1944, the Allied campaign in Normandy was strangling on its own ambition. 2 months after D-Day, the British and Canadians were still locked in a grinding war of attrition south of Caen. The bocage, dense hedgerow country, swallowed tanks and men alike. The terrain ahead was open, gently rolling farmland that looked inviting on a map, but in reality offered perfect fields of fire for German anti-tank guns. And behind those guns sat some of the most dangerous formations in the Wehrmacht. The 89th Infantry Division held the front line. The remnants of the 272nd Grenadier Division plugged the gaps, and lurking in reserve, its reputation built on fanaticism and brutality, was the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, teenage soldiers turned killers under the command of SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer. They had Tiger tanks. They had 88mm guns that could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 yards, and they knew the ground intimately. Previous Canadian attacks had bled themselves white against this wall. Operation Spring in late July had been a catastrophe, one of the worst single days of casualties the Canadian Army would suffer in the entire war. Operation Atlantic had gained ground but failed to break the line. The pattern was always the same. Canadian infantry advances on foot, exposed across open fields, while German guns picked them apart from concealed positions. The infantry couldn't keep up with the tanks. The tanks couldn't survive without the artillery infantry. It was a brutal, simple equation. Every senior Allied commander understood the strategic stakes. If the Canadians could break through south of Caen and reach Falaise, they would form the northern jaw of a massive encirclement. The Americans, under Patton, were already sweeping east and north from Avranches. If the two forces met, the bulk of the German army in Normandy, perhaps 100,000 men, would be trapped. General Omar Bradley saw the moment clearly. "This is an opportunity that comes to a commander not more than once in a century," he said. "We're about to destroy an entire hostile army, but that jaw could not close unless the Canadians moved. And they could not move using the same methods that had already failed." The problem landed on the desk of one man. Guy Simonds was not what anyone expected of a Canadian general. Born in England, raised in Canada, educated at the Royal Military College in Kingston, he was sharp, austere, and intellectually restless. At 41, he was the youngest corps commander in the entire British Commonwealth. Montgomery respected him. Crerar, the Canadian Army commander, trusted him. The troops under him had a more complicated relationship. They recognized his brilliance but found him cold, remote, a man who lived in plans rather than among his soldiers. But Simonds had something that no other Allied corps commander in Normandy possessed at that moment: the willingness to throw out the rulebook entirely. He studied the failures of the summer. He studied the terrain, and he understood something fundamental. The problem was not courage. Canadian soldiers had proven that beyond any question. The problem was exposure. Infantry advancing on foot across open ground against dug-in German positions was suicide. The solution was not to find better infantry tactics, it was to eliminate the infantry's vulnerability altogether. Simonds looked at the lines of surplus M7 Priest self-propelled guns sitting idle behind the front. American-built, lightly armored, their 105mm guns had been replaced by towed 25-pounders. They were surplus, useless, waiting to be shipped back. He saw something else entirely. Strip the gun. Weld shut the opening. You have a steel box, on tracks that can carry 12 men at the same speed as a Sherman tank, protected from everything except a direct hit from an anti-tank round. Infantry could now ride into battle, dismounting only when they were already inside the German defenses. No army had ever done this. There was no doctrine for it, no manual, no precedent. Simonds ordered between 72 and 78 priests converted in a matter of days. The men who would ride in them nicknamed them Kangaroos. It was a purely Canadian invention, born from desperation and genius in equal measure, and it was about to change the way wars were fought. Simonds built his plan around a single radical idea: attack at night in mass without a preparatory artillery barrage. Every conventional instinct in the Allied command structure screamed against this. Night attacks were small unit affairs, company-level probes, raids, diversions. You did not send 600 vehicles into darkness along a 4-mile corridor against prepared defenses. The risk of confusion was staggering. Vehicles would collide. Units would lose direction. Friendly fire was almost guaranteed. Simonds knew all of this. He planned around it. RAF Bomber Command would saturate the German flanks with high explosives, creating walls of destruction on either side of the corridor. The armored columns, tanks and Kangaroos mixed together, would advance behind a creeping barrage, guided by radio direction finders, tracer rounds fired on fixed lines, and searchlights bounced off the clouds to create artificial moonlight. The attack would come in 2 phases. The first wave would bypass the German front line entirely, punching through to capture the anti-tank gun positions at Crémenil and Saint-Aignan-de-Crémenil. Then the 4th Canadian Armoured Division and the ET, 1st Polish Armoured Division, would pour through the gap and drive straight for Falaise. On the evening of August 7th, the columns formed up. Tanks, Kangaroos, half-tracks, mine-flail vehicles, all arranged in precise order. Inside the Kangaroos, Canadian infantrymen sat shoulder to shoulder in the dark, feeling the vibration of the engine through the steel floor, hearing the distant thunder of the bombers beginning their runs. At 2300 hours, over 1,000 heavy bombers struck. The earth heaved. The flanks of the corridor erupted in fire. The German 89th Infantry Division, positioned directly under the bombs, simply ceased to function as a coherent fighting force. At 23:30, the columns moved, and immediately, chaos. The dust was impenetrable. Drivers who had rehearsed in daylight found themselves blind. Vehicles veered off course. Some drove into bomb craters. Others collided with friendly tanks. Radio nets crackled with frantic calls for direction. Navigation aids, the tracer lines, the searchlights, were swallowed by the dust clouds. Several columns fragmented. Officers screamed orders that no one could hear above the engine roar, but the mass kept moving. This was the genius of Simons's design. The columns were so broad, so dense, so heavy, that even in confusion they maintained forward momentum. Individual vehicles wandered. The attack itself did not. The German front line never had a chance. The 89th Division, already shattered by the bombing, was overrun before its survivors could orient themselves. Canadian infantry dismounted from their Kangaroos directly onto German positions, clearing trenches and gun pits in close combat while the tanks rolled past. Casualties among the Kangaroo-born infantry were dramatically lower than in any previous Canadian attack. The armored carriers worked exactly as Simonds had predicted. By dawn on August 8th, the first phase objectives had been taken. The corridor was open, the breach was real, and then the second phase began to unravel. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division was green. This was their first major operation. Their commanders were untested in the kind of fast-moving armored warfare that Simonds' plan demanded, and the terrain south of the breakthrough point was deceptive, open enough to look easy but laced with hidden anti-tank positions manned by the one German formation that had not been touched by the bombing. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. Kurt Meyer had positioned his remaining Tiger tanks and 88mm guns along a partially built defensive line, and as the Canadian armor pushed south on August 8th, they drove straight into a killing ground. Tiger tanks and anti-tank guns opened fire at range, knocking out Shermans before their crews could identify the source. The advance stalled. The momentum that Simonds had built through the night attack began to bleed away. Then came the tragedy of Worthington Force. A battle group built around 52 tanks of the British Columbia Regiment and infantry from the Algonquin Regiment was ordered to seize Hill 195, a commanding piece of high ground on the road to Falaise. In the dust and confusion of the advance, the column lost direction entirely. They arrived not at Hill 195 but at Hill 140, the wrong objective, deep in German-held territory, surrounded on three sides. The Germans closed in. By 5 in the afternoon, Worthington Force had been virtually destroyed. Nearly all 52 tanks were knocked out. Lieutenant Colonel Worthington was killed. The survivors were captured or forced to withdraw in scattered groups. It was a devastating blow, not because it changed the strategic picture, but because it revealed the cost of inexperience at the sharp end of armored warfare. By August 11th, Operation Totalize had gained almost 9 miles. The German front was broken. The 89th Division was destroyed. The approach to Falaise was open, but the town itself, the hinge of the entire encirclement, remained in German hands. 7 miles to the south, Simonds had cracked the wall. Now he had to tear through it. 3 days of reorganization. Replacements absorbed. Tanks repaired or replaced. The Canadian Grenadier Guards, who had been reduced to 23 operational Shermans, could scrounge only 10 replacements. Some regiments were at half strength. The men were exhausted, but they understood the stakes. Every hour that Falaise remained in German hands was an hour in which the enemy could escape the tightening noose. On August 14th, Simonds launched Operation Tractable. This time, the attack came in daylight. 800 Avro Lancaster and Handley Page Halifax heavy bombers struck German positions along the front. Canadian artillery laid a massive smokescreen across the entire axis of advance, blinding German observers and anti-tank gunners. Behind the smoke, 2 Canadian divisions surged south, but the Germans had been given a gift. On the night of August 13th, a Canadian officer had lost his way, driven into German lines, and been captured. On his body, the Germans found a complete copy of Simonds' operational orders for Tractable. Every axis of advance, every phase line, every objective. The 12th SS Panzer Division repositioned immediately. Meyer placed the bulk of his remaining strength, 500 grenadiers, 15 tanks, and 12 88mm anti-tank guns, directly across the Canadians' expected line of approach. It was a textbook ambush built on perfect intelligence. It slowed the Canadians. It did not stop them. The smokescreen, which the Germans had not anticipated in their repositioning, disrupted their fields of fire. Canadian armor pushed through gaps in the anti-tank screen. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division and the 1st Polish Armoured Division forced crossings of the Laison River under fire. The advance was brutal, costly, and relentless. On August 16th, the Canadian 2nd Infantry Division broke into Falaise itself. What followed was 48 hours of savage urban combat. Meyer's SS Panzer Grenadiers fought from the rubble, using every collapsed wall and shattered building as a firing position. The Canadians cleared the town block by block, room by room, in the kind of close-quarters fighting where training matters less than nerve. By August 18th, Falaise was Canadian, but Simonds was already looking past the town. The real prize was not Falaise. It was the gap east of Falaise, the corridor between Troon and Chambois through which the remnants of 2 German armies were now desperately trying to escape. Simonds understood the geometry of the battle faster than anyone above him. While Montgomery was already thinking about the Seine and the advance into Germany, Simonds was staring at the map and seeing the 6-kilometre gap between Trun and Chambois, 6 kilometers through which 100,000 Germans were pouring, eastward in a river of men, vehicles, horses, and guns. He had already sent the 1st Polish Armored Division on a wide sweep to the southeast, racing to meet the Americans at Chambois. Now he ordered the 4th Canadian Armored Division to pivot south and seize Trun. Montgomery's orders were blunt. It is absolutely essential that both the armored divisions of 2 Canadian Corps close the gap. By mid-afternoon on August 18th, the Canadians held Trun. The Poles were approaching Chambois. But between them, a 6-kilometre stretch of farmland, villages, and river crossings remained open, and through that gap, thousands of German soldiers were moving east in the largest organized retreat since Stalingrad. Simonds ordered Brigadier Jim Jefferson's 10th Infantry Brigade to close the gap. Jefferson looked at his available forces and made a calculation that must have felt like a death sentence. He had the tanks of the South Alberta Regiment and the rifle companies of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders of Canada. That was it. A single armored regiment and a battalion of infantry to plug a 6-kilometre hole against 2 retreating German armies. Jefferson sent Major David Currie forward with C Squadron of the South Albertas, 15 Sherman tanks, and a single company of Argylls under Major Ivan Martin, 55 infantrymen, 15 tanks. Their objective: the village of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, where a bridge over the river Dives offered the last viable crossing point for heavy German vehicles. Currie's force reached Saint-Lambert at dusk on August 18th. The village was a straggle of stone farmhouses on both sides of a road leading to the bridge. German troops held it in strength. What happened next, over the following 3 days, would produce the only Victoria Cross awarded to a Canadian soldier during the entire Normandy campaign. At last light on August 18th, Major Currie did something that defied every principle of armored command. He dismounted from his tank, walked through the German outposts on foot, alone, and reconnoitered the village defenses personally. Mortar rounds were falling. He could hear German voices in the buildings. He mapped the positions, located the disabled, tanks whose crews needed extraction, and returned through the lines. The next morning, without artillery support, without air cover, Currie personally led the attack. The lead Sherman was hit almost immediately by an 88mm round. The advance shifted to the Argyll infantry, who moved house to house, clearing German soldiers from stone buildings with grenades and small arms. They destroyed a Panther tank at close range. By noon, Currie's force held half the village, and then the counterattacks began. For the next 36 hours, German forces threw everything they had at St. Lambert: tanks, infantry, paratroopers. The village sat astride the last usable escape route, and the German command knew it. Wave after wave hit Currie's position. His Shermans fired until their barrels were hot. His infantry fought from windows, rooftops, and rubble piles. Every officer under Currie's command was killed or wounded. He was the only officer standing. He moved between positions constantly, directing tank fire, redistributing ammunition, rallying men who had every reason to break. At one point, he personally directed his command tank's fire onto a Tiger tank that had been harassing the position, and knocked it out. During another attack, while his tank's main gun engaged distant targets, Currie grabbed a rifle and fired from the turret at German snipers who had infiltrated to within 50 yards. When 40 reinforcements finally reached his position, the only time resupply got through, Currie personally led them forward, explained their positions, and described the importance of holding. When they broke and fell back under fire, he collected them himself, walked them back into position, and held them there through the force of his presence alone. They did not break again. One of his non-commissioned officers later said, "We knew at one stage that it was going to be a fight to a finish, but he was so cool about it, it was impossible for us to get excited." At dusk on August 20th, the Germans mounted a final, desperate assault. Currie's force routed the attackers before they could even deploy. Then he ordered an immediate counterattack and seized the rest of the village. In 3 days, Currie's Small force destroyed 7 enemy tanks, 12 88mm guns, and 40 vehicles. 300 Germans were killed. 500 were wounded. 2,100 were captured. The remnants of 2 German armies were denied their escape route. Currie obtained 1 hour of sleep during the entire 72-hour battle. When his force was finally relieved, he confirmed the turnover was complete, stood still for a moment, and fell asleep on his feet. He collapsed where he stood. He was 32 years old, a mechanic and welder from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. While Currie held St. Lambert, the Polish 1st Armored Division, fighting under Canadian command, was waging its own epic battle 6 kilometers to the southeast. The Poles, under Major General Stanisław Maciek, had swept around the German flank in a wide arc and seized the high ground of Hill 262, known to the Poles as the Makzuga, the Mace. From this commanding ridge, they could see the entire eastern edge of the Falaise Pocket spread below them. Roads choked with retreating German vehicles, columns of men and horses moving in the open, artillery targets everywhere. The Poles called in fire. Canadian medium artillery, under the direction of Captain Pierre Sévigny, a forward observation officer from the 4th Canadian Medium Regiment, rained shells onto the German escape routes. The effect was devastating. Convoys were shattered, vehicles burned. The road through Chambois became a graveyard. But Hill 262 was also a target. Paul Hauser, commander of the trapped German 7th Army, ordered the Polish positions eliminated. From inside the pocket, the remnants of the 352nd Infantry Division and battle groups from the 2nd SS Panzer Division attacked uphill against the Polish perimeter. From outside the pocket, Field Marshal Walter Model ordered the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen to attack from the east, attempting to crack the ring open and create an escape corridor. The Poles were hit from both sides simultaneously. For 2 days they held, without resupply, without reinforcement. Their ammunition dwindled to almost nothing. Wounded men lay untreated in foxholes. The fighting was hand-to-hand in places. German tanks pushed to within yards of the Polish command post. Artillery from both inside and outside the pocket converged on the ridge. On the morning of August 21st, the Canadian Grenadier Guards led 3 armored regiments south toward Hill 262. Their war diary captures what they found. Number 1 Squadron led off at 800 hours in the pouring rain. The road, as were all the roads in the area, was lined and in places practically blocked by destroyed German vehicles of every description. Horses and men lay rotting in every ditch and hedge, and the air was rank with the odor of putrefaction. Most of the destruction was caused by the Air Force, but the Poles had done their share. Number 1 Squadron's coaxes fired almost continually, until arriving at Put 262. The picture at 262 was the grimmest the regiment had so far come up against. The Poles had had no supplies for 3 days. They had several hundred wounded who had not been evacuated. About 700 prisoners of war lay loosely guarded in a field, unburied dead, and parts of them were strewn about by the score. The Poles cried with joy when we arrived. The cork was in the bottle. The Falaise Pocket was sealed. What the Allies found inside the pocket defied the language of military reporting. The battlefield investigators from 21 Army Group's Operational Research Section arrived within days. They divided the Us-Tu devastation into 4 zones. The area west of the Argenton-Falaise Highway they called the Pocket. The killing ground between the highway and Vimoutier they named the Shambles. The path from Vimoutier to the Seine became the Chase, and the river crossings were simply the Seine crossing. They counted more than 8,000 destroyed, damaged, or abandoned vehicles, 456 tanks and self-propelled guns, 367 lightly armored vehicles, 2,447 soft-skinned trucks and transport. A subsequent survey raised the total to over 12,000 vehicles. Villages had been obliterated. Equipment made some roads impassable. The corpses of soldiers, civilians, horses, and cattle lay everywhere, tangled together in ditches, crushed under vehicles, scattered across fields. In the August heat, the decomposition was rapid and overwhelming. Maggots covered the bodies. Swarms of flies descended on the area in clouds so thick that pilots reported the stench from hundreds of feet in the air. The area was eventually declared an unhealthy zone. The clearing process, which required bulldozers for the animal carcasses, alone would not be completed until November. General Dwight D. Eisenhower walked through the pocket 48 hours after it was sealed. His words became some of the most quoted of the entire war. The battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas. 48 hours after the closing of the gap, I was conducted through it, on foot, to encounter scenes that could be described only by Dante. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. The numbers told only part of the story. Between 10 and 15,000 German soldiers were killed inside the pocket. 40 to 50,000 were captured. The equipment losses were catastrophic. The formations that escaped did so as men on foot, not as fighting units. Tanks, artillery, transport, communications equipment, all of it was left behind in the wreckage. Montgomery called the victory definite, complete, and decisive. He was not wrong. But the price of that decisiveness had been paid disproportionately by the men who had actually closed the gap, Canadians and Poles. The argument over Falaise began before the last shots were fired and has never truly ended. Could the pocket have been closed sooner? Should Bradley have allowed Patton to push north past Argentan? Did Montgomery wait too long to apply maximum pressure? These questions fill libraries and will never be answered to everyone's satisfaction. But certain facts are beyond debate. The Canadian Army, under Guy Simonds' the 2 Canadian Corps, bore the primary burden of closing the Falaise Pocket from the north. They attacked continuously for 2 weeks across open ground defended by some of the most experienced and fanatical formations in the German military. They did so while innovating in real time, creating new weapons, new tactics, and new methods of combined arms warfare that had no precedent in any army's doctrine. The Kangaroo armored personnel carrier, born from Simons's imagination and built from American surplus, proved so successful that it spawned an entirely new class of military vehicle. Ram tanks were soon converted in large numbers. 2 dedicated regiments, the 1st Canadian Armoured Carrier Regiment and the British 49th Armoured Personnel Carrier Regiment, were formed specifically to operate Kangaroos for the rest of the war. The concept of mechanized infantry, riding into battle in armored vehicles alongside tanks, became a permanent feature of every modern army. It began in a Canadian field workshop in August 1944. Simonds himself went on to command the 1st Canadian Army in the final months of the war when General Guy was on medical leave. He was never the warmest of leaders, but his operational mind was among the sharpest on either side of the conflict. His willingness to innovate under pressure, to reject failed methods and invent new ones, saved Canadian lives and accelerated the end of the war in Northwest Europe. David Currie returned to the front lines after St. Lambert. He fought through the clearing of the Channel ports and the brutal Scheldt campaign before being pulled from the line to receive his Victoria Cross from King George VI. His medal, the only VC awarded to a Canadian during the Normandy campaign, and the only one ever given to a member of the Royal Canadian Armoured Corps, was later acquired by the Canadian War Museum, where it remains. Currie served as Sergeant-at-Arms in the House of Commons from 1960 until 1978. He never sought attention for what he had done. He didn't need to. The men who served under him remembered. The Poles of the 1st Armoured Division, fighting under Canadian Command, earned a place in military history at Hill 262 that no passage of time can diminish. Their stand against simultaneous attacks from 2 directions by SS Panzer divisions, without supply, without relief, without complaint, was one of the finest defensive actions of the entire war. They held the line that completed the encirclement. Without them, thousands more Germans would have escaped. And the young men of the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, green and untested when Totalize began, emerged from Falaise as veterans. They had made mistakes. Worthington Force was proof enough of that. But they had also learned faster than anyone expected, fought harder than anyone predicted, and closed a gap that senior Allied commanders had been content to leave to the Air Force. The Falaise Pocket broke the German army in France, not merely weakened it, broke it. The formations that escaped, and some did, perhaps 20 to 50,000 men, crossed the Seine as shattered remnants. They had no tanks, no artillery, no transport. They were soldiers in name only, streaming eastward with nothing but their rifles and the knowledge that everything behind them was gone. The liberation of Paris followed within days. The Allied advance across France accelerated beyond anyone's predictions. By September, the front line had moved hundreds of miles east, and the German army was scrambling to build a new defensive line along its own borders. None of this was inevitable. The pocket could have remained open. The German retreat could have been orderly. The formations that fought so savagely at Mortain and Falaise could have reconstituted behind the Seine and fought again in strength. What prevented that was the relentless, grinding, innovative pressure applied by Canadian soldiers across 2 weeks of continuous combat. They attacked at night when no one had done so before. They rode into battle in vehicles that had not existed. A week earlier, they held villages with 60 men against 2 retreating armies. They sealed a pocket that senior commanders had been ready to leave half-closed. German commanders who survived the pocket spoke of the Canadian advance with a particular kind of respect, the respect born not of fear alone, but of disbelief. They had expected the Canadians to pause after Totalize, to consolidate after Falaise fell, to slow down, as armies do when they have taken heavy casualties and face diminishing returns. They never slowed down. From the night of August 7th, when the first Kangaroos lurched forward into the darkness south of Caen, to the morning of August 21st, when the Canadian Grenadier Guards reached the weeping, bloodied Polish defenders on Hill 262, the Canadian Army did not stop. Not for exhaustion, not for casualties, not for the failures and mistakes that are inevitable in the chaos of modern war. They adapted, they invented, they held. And when the dust finally settled over the roads of Normandy, over the burned-out panthers and the bloated horses and the thousands of gray uniformed bodies lying in the August sun, the world understood something that the men from Moose Jaw and Montreal and Medicine Hat had known all along. Canada did not come to Normandy to participate. Canada came to decide it.